All right, how's it going, everyone? I hope you guys are doing okay out there. So today I'm going to be presenting to you the case of Capitol Records versus ReDigi. This case was first presented to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in July of 2016, and by December of 2018 the court had reached their decision. So this is a pretty recent court case, in my opinion, and it's a pretty interesting one. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So we'll start with the factual background. We're going to be talking about who was involved and what they did. And the first party that we'll discuss is the defendant, which in this case was ReDigi. So ReDigi was a company founded in 2009 by John Ossenmacher and Larry Rudolph. John Ossenmacher got the idea for ReDigi when his daughter pitched the idea of a Dropbox where people could donate their unwanted digital music content. So John took that idea and ran with it, being a tech entrepreneur. And he partnered up with Larry Rudolph, who's a computer science professor at MIT, and together the two of them launched ReDigi to the public in 2011. So what was ReDigi? It was a web-based digital music service that offered its users free, unlimited cloud storage for their legally purchased digital music files. The more controversial aspect of ReDigi, though, was they claimed that they had developed the world's first legal online marketplace that allowed users to buy and sell pre-owned digital music files. So I'll discuss here a little bit about the functionality of ReDigi, but I'm going to talk about the specifics of how it functioned in the causes of action section in this presentation. And the reason for that is because there was no one particular use or a particular set of uses of Capitol's copyrighted works that caused them to file a lawsuit against ReDigi, but rather they had a problem with the entire premise of ReDigi. So for that reason, I'll cover the specifics of how ReDigi functioned in the causes of action section. But for now, just so you can get a general understanding of what ReDigi was, in addition to offering users the ability to store music on their cloud or to sell it on the marketplace, users were also able to stream music they had uploaded to ReDigi, or they could re-download the files to their device if they wanted to. And all of ReDigi's web-based services were facilitated by a software called the Music Manager, which it required its users to download. And the Music Manager performed two functions. The first was that it identified all of the eligible music files on a user's device that could be uploaded to ReDigi. And second, it constantly monitored users' devices to ensure that they were not retaining any copies of files that they had already uploaded to ReDigi. So essentially, the Music Manager was a part of their system that they thought ensured that they were facilitating legal transactions. And ReDigi was only available to the public for about 4 months before the company was brought to court by Capitol with claims of copyright infringement. And in those 4 months, ReDigi had acquired several thousand users, but unfortunately that growth slowed drastically once Capitol's copyright infringement claims were made public. And so now we'll talk about the plaintiff, which in this case there were actually 3 of them. And the plaintiffs were Capitol Records, Capitol Christian Music Group, and Virgin Records IR Holdings. But for this case, these 3 plaintiffs were collectively referred to simply as Capitol. And I don't think I need to explain too much detail as to what Capitol is, but for the sake of formalities, Capitol Records is a record label owned by Universal Music Group, and they own a massive catalog of popular sound recordings, which includes hits like I Saw Her Standing There by the Beatles and Come Fly With Me by Frank Sinatra. So, on January 6, 2012, Capitol filed an official complaint against ReDigi with the District Court for the Southern District of New York. And they allege that ReDigi's system infringed a variety of their exclusive rights that are protected under the Copyright Act of 1976. And these rights included their right to reproduction, right to distribution, and their public display and public performance rights. And on March 30th, 2013, the district court ruled in favor of Capitol, finding that ReDigi had infringed Capitol's reproduction and distribution rights. However, they made no comment on the issue of public display and public performance, and I'll explain that a little bit later in this presentation. So the outcome of the district court's decision was that ReDigi was ordered to shut down their website and cease operations, and they were ordered to pay Capital $3.5 million in damages. Considering the fact that ReDigi was a startup, this was a pretty devastating financial blow to them, and it took them a few years to sort through their bankruptcy proceedings before they could actually file an appeal. So for that reason, it wasn't until July 1st of 2016 that ReDigi was able to file their appeal with the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And now we'll talk about the causes of action. So to really understand why Capital took action against ReDigi, we're going to have to understand some more of the specifics about how ReDigi's system worked. So like I mentioned before, users were required to download the Music Manager, which was responsible for identifying which files on a user's device were eligible to be uploaded. And the Music Manager only flagged files as eligible if it could verify that these files had been legally purchased from iTunes or from another ReDigi user. And it also checked to make sure that files had not been tampered with or altered in any way. And once a Music Manager had deemed a file eligible for upload, ReDigi employed a proprietary file transfer method, which they were convinced allowed them to facilitate the legal transfer of digital music files. So ReDigi called this file transfer method data migration. And to migrate a file, ReDigi would break apart music files into smaller components of roughly 4,000 bytes in length. And it would move them one piece at a time from the user's hard drive into the computer buffer. And as each piece was moved into the user's computer buffer system, ReDigi would send a delete command back to the user's device, removing that part of the file from the user's hard drive. And it repeated this process until all pieces of the file were moved into the computer buffer and deleted from the user's hard drive. And once that process was complete, the file would be reassembled into a usable format and then migrated to ReDigi's server. And again, once that file was moved to ReDigi's server, users could stream it, they could re-download the file to their device, or they could put it up for sale on the marketplace. And another important feature about ReDigi is that in the marketplace, it offered free 30-second previews of songs that were available for purchase, and it also displayed the associated album artwork for those songs. ReDigi claimed that they initially held licenses through a third party to provide these streams and to display this album artwork, but they also contended that they lost these licenses shortly after their launch, at which point they stopped providing these streams and stopped displaying album artwork, and instead they redirected users to iTunes or YouTube for previews. So Capital had a variety of issues with this system. The first was that Capital claimed that ReDigi's system inherently required the production of new copies of digital files, which violated their exclusive reproduction right under Section 106 of the Copyright Act. Additionally, Capital did not permit the resale of any of their copyrighted works on ReDigi's website, which they claimed violated their distribution right under Section 106. And finally, they also did not permit ReDigi to provide those 30-second previews or to display album artwork, which Capital also claimed violated their public performance and public display right. So let's move on to the court reasoning and decision. So both the district court and the Court of Appeals, it was their responsibility to determine whether or not ReDigi's system was actually creating new copies of digital files, or if it was doing what ReDigi said it did, which was moving specific instances of digital files from one device to another. So ReDigi had a variety of facts about their system that they presented to the court in the hopes that it would substantiate their claim that they were moving files from one place to another. And two of their main points were that During the transfer process, the size of the original file, the total sum of data that constituted that file was never exceeded, and also that a file never was allowed to exist in two places at once. The court disagreed with this, and essentially the court argued that the device in which a digital sound recording is stored is technically considered a phonorecord, and that when a music file is downloaded to a new device, a new phonorecord is made. So, using that logic, the court determined that Capitol's reproduction right had been infringed. And in terms of their distribution right, it was a little bit easier for the courts to recognize that the distribution right had been infringed because neither party disputed that ReDigi was offering copyrighted works owned by Capitol on their website. And because Capitol did not grant permission for that, the court easily was able to determine that the distribution right was also infringed. So the court actually wound up not making any comments on whether or not ReDigi had infringed their public display and public performance rights. And I think that has to do with a variety of factors. Primarily, I think it's because they viewed those as secondary issues to the reproduction and distribution. And also, there was a lot of ambiguity surrounding the supposed licenses that ReDigi had to provide those streams. But also because ReDigi had stopped providing those once they lost their supposed licenses, again, it was viewed as just a secondary issue. So now that the court had determined that ReDigi had infringed Capitol's distribution and reproduction rights, it turned to copyright law to see if there were any valid defenses that they could use. So ReDigi claimed fair use was a defense. And the overall statement that they provided to the court claiming that fair use was a valid defense is that ReDigi's system facilitated a beneficial economic practice in the form of a secondary market for digital music files. So they essentially likened their digital system to the digital version of a record store where people could go and buy and sell used copies of music. So in considering fair use, the court had to look to the four factors provided by copyright law. The first of which is the character of the use. The second is the nature of the copyrighted work itself. The third factor is the portion of the copyrighted work that was used. And the fourth factor is the commercial impact that the secondary use has on the market. So in considering these four factors, the court had decided that the character of the use was unchanged. There was no commentary or criticism added. It was not transformative in any way. Essentially, ReDigi was providing the same product to the same consumers for the same reasons. And in considering the second factor for fair use, they did not actually consider this. They realized that it was not really an applicable factor because it is typically a factor that is considered in association with the first. But because the character of the use was unchanged, the nature of the work itself was not necessarily as important. And they also noted that sound recordings are at the very core of what copyright law is supposed to protect. So the nature, again, was not considered to be a applicable consideration in this case. And considering the third factor, this worked against ReDigi because they were using the entirety of Capitol's copyrighted works. They were reproducing identical copies of digital files that were copyrighted or that Capitol owned the copyright for. So that factor also worked against ReDigi's claim to fair use. And then the fourth factor also worked against ReDigi because it had a negative commercial impact on the copyright holder. So essentially, what ReDigi was doing was offering the same exact product to the same consumers that would otherwise purchase those digital files from Capitol, but they were selling it at a cheaper price. So it basically had an unfair and negative impact on Capitol. So the fourth factor also worked against ReDigi's fair use argument. And in considering all four of these factors together, the court had determined that fair use was an invalid defense. However, ReDigi also claimed first sale as a possible defense. So the first sale doctrine basically states that the owner of a particular copy of a copyrighted work has the right to sell that copy or to otherwise dispose of it. So ReDigi basically was claiming that their platform was allowing users to exercise a right that they had that was protected by copyright law. So again, they were claiming that users were free to sell copies that they legally own. However, the court was able to determine that the first sale defense does not apply to unlawfully produced copies. And because the court had already determined that ReDigi's system was making new copies of copyrighted digital files, the first sale defense could not be applied to those unlawfully produced copies. So first sale was also determined to be an invalid defense, and the Second Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the district court's ruling. So now we'll go ahead and try to compare and contrast this case to some other related cases. So this case, Yang versus Mike Network. Stephen Yang was a photographer who licensed a photo that he had taken to the New York Post for an article that they were running. And the Mike Network, which publishes their own articles, they used a screenshot of the New York Post article which contained Stephen Yang's photo. They used a screenshot of that for an opinion piece that they were running on the New York Post article. And so Yang sued for copyright infringement because Mike Network was using his photo without permission. And the Mike Network claimed fair use. And so in this case, the court actually cited Capital versus ReDigi, but they sort of used the opposite logic as in Capital versus ReDigi, because essentially what they looked at was the fourth factor of fair use, which is the commercial impact of the second use, the second unlicensed use. And because the court determined that no consumer would use the screenshot of Yang's photo as a substitute for the original, especially because it wasn't a screenshot of the whole photo, it was just a portion of it. They determined that no consumer would try to use the Mike Network version of Yang's photo. If they wanted to use that photo for any reason, they would have to go direct to Yang. And they basically determined that this did not have any kind of negative commercial impact on the copyright holder, which in this case was Stephen Yang. And so Capital versus ReDigi was cited, again, to use like the opposite logic, that because this was not a substitute for the original, they were able to say that this was fair use. All right, and I think I got a little ahead of myself there talking about this case, but yeah, so this slide is really just going to sum up what I was just talking about, how Capital versus ReDigi was used in considering the fourth factor for fair use, and kind of using the opposite logic as in Capital versus ReDigi, they were able to determine fair use for this case. And the second case that we're going to look at here is pretty identical actually to Capital versus ReDigi. So Andrew Paul Leonard was a photographer that specialized in microscopic imaging, and he had a company called APL Microscopic LLC. And he had discovered that NASA had actually published one of his photos to their website back in 2004. This was not a licensed use of Andrew Paul Leonard's images, so he filed a lawsuit against the United States government alleging copyright infringement. And this case was brought to the Court of Federal Claims, which relied pretty heavily on Capital versus ReDigi. They basically used the same exact logic in Capital versus ReDigi, which said that when a piece of digital content is downloaded to a device, a new copy is produced. So they argued that when NASA uploaded a copy of Leonard's photo to their server, they had unlawfully generated a new copy. And for that reason, they were able to rule in favor of Leonard, finding that it was not a fair use, and that the United States had infringed Andrew Paul Leonard's um, copyrighted photo. So we'll talk about my perspective here. I think this was an extremely complicated case that begged a lot of philosophical questions regarding um, the transfer of information and whether or not it is even possible to transfer specific pieces of data through the internet. And I actually was pretty shocked that there were no expert witnesses or computer scientists brought in to this case to really talk about um, the specifics of ReDigi system and maybe apply some actual science to this case. To me, it felt like every party involved was kind of talking about things they didn't necessarily understand. Um, that being said, I was able to think of an interesting comparison to compare this case to, which is a popular thought experiment called the Ship of Theseus. So if you guys bear with me here, I'll try to explain this. So the Ship of Theseus is a thought experiment that asks you to consider if there's a ship and you replaced each part of that ship one at a time until eventually you replace all of the parts. Um, the question becomes, can the ship that has had all of its parts replaced, can it still be considered the same fundamental object? And this is also not referred this is referred to as a thought experiment and also a paradox because there really is no answer to this. Um, but I think this really perfectly mirrors the Capital versus ReDigi case because the pieces of the ship can be equated to the pieces of the files that ReDigi's system was transferring. And they were essentially rebuilding the ship with new parts, with copied parts in a new place. Um, but I would ask you to consider that if you have a ship where you replace all of the parts, what would happen if you took the original parts and then built the ship back together again? You would essentially wind up with two ships. And ReDigi's logic is that, well, if you destroy all of the original pieces, that doesn't really matter. However, the court's logic was that you can't deny the fact that there's still the possibility for there to be two ships. So I think kind of using that logic, it shows that the court was right in their decision for this case, that Capital's, or rather ReDigi system, um, was creating new pieces, and that the fact that they were deleting the old pieces off of a user's device didn't necessarily matter. It was just the fact that they were actually producing new copies is what infringed Capital's right. And because they were producing new copies, they could not use first sale as a defense. And again, I got a little bit ahead of myself, but again, this kind of is just summing up kind of what I was just talking about. Additionally, I also think that this case kind of reveals some flaws in U.S. copyright law. I will say that I do agree with ReDigi to a degree that it is unfair that there is no secondary market for digital files. But unfortunately, I just don't think that we have the computer technology right now to definitively say that you can move data from one computer to another. As computers work right now, you have to produce new data on a new computer. There's no way to just say that you can take a file and move it from one place to the other. Um, in some of my research, I was reading about people's comments on this case, and there are various parties who think that a potential um, solution for this problem is to have copyright law incorporate a resale royalty, which would allow for a secondary market to buy and sell digital music files, but would also make sure to fairly compensate the original copyright holder. So that's all I got for you guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it wasn't a little too confusing. And yeah, hope you guys are staying safe and healthy.